Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. Well, we took a look at the first round games last episode. This is part 2 of our kind of holiday episodes for all of you out there. Hope you're enjoying this wonderful week and whatever holidays you enjoy celebrating yourselves. We're going to take a look at the round of 8. We have 4 quarterfinals, traditional bowl sites. We're going to be talking about those, breaking them down just a little bit in the kind of a more abbreviated holiday week episode. But before we get to it, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights, run polls, listen to your feedback. Take a moment if you can to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. But let's get to it. So, our brackets were what they were, and it turns out just all the favorites won, or at least the higher seeded teams won. So we get basically the top 8 squaring off in the quarterfinals. Look at that. The rest of them were almost extraneous. Of course, both of us do think they were great. We're happy that we got those first round games, but instead we do get a chance to see it truly the top 8 teams, although top 8 seeded teams. Maybe we'll get to that in a general question. We're going to, of course, have the Rose Bowl, traditional or Oregon-Ohio State matchup. The Peach Bowl is going to have Arizona State, Texas. The Sugar Bowl is going to have Georgia, Notre Dame. And the Fiesta is going to have Boise State, Penn State. But before we get into those details, first of all, how are you feeling right now, Shehan? It feels like you're still ill. It's almost like we're recording these back-to-back, and you're still as sick as you were in the last episode.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, did Michael Jordan have flu games? I don't know. I think he only could do one of those. So hopefully we clinch the title today, because I don't know how much more I can go on like this.
Joe Montana chicken soup game, if we're going to college football theme here. Oh, my goodness. So, one of the kind of the general questions I have going into this, and this I do think, and for example, they can theoretically make changes for next season. They just have to be unanimous among all the conference commissioners. But then there will potentially be some tweaking, not for next season, but the 2026 season after that. But I do have questions about whether or not the buys that people were really excited about make sense. That question has come up. Now, attrition is always a potential factor. But at the same time, I mean, it's been said before. Now, Oregon doesn't get the benefit of having a home field game. They're going to be sitting there. They now get to host Ohio State, potentially the most ferocious team in a neutral site game. But is this something where, or at the very least, maybe they should have just gone straight rankings where, we would have not necessarily had Boise State getting a bye. What do you make of that kind of that discussion that's been going on right now?
I mean, one of the things I loved about this system is that it valued conference championships, and that's something that I think has taken a little bit of a back seat in the CFP era. Like, I think that conference championships have been devalued. I think all of a sudden now they are way more valuable than they've ever been. If you're a team who's mad that a team that won a conference championship finished ahead of them, well, like, I'd say go win your conference. Like, go do the big goal that your team has before the season and win your conference. If your response is, well, my conference is really hard, I don't know, go to a worse conference. I don't know what to tell you. Like, the MAC is taking applications. The Pac-12, I'm sure, will accept you. But, like, don't complain if you're mad that you can't win your own conference. Like, that's just the name of the game in college football, is you go into the season, your job is to win your conference, compete for national championships. Those are the 2 goals that every team in the country publicly states before the season. If you win your conference, yeah, I do think you should get an advantage.
All right, I think that's fair. It'll be interesting to see how this particular round plays out. If it doesn't play out particularly well, if we start to see, I do wonder though, I'm concerned if we start to see some blowouts of especially of course the G5 and the Big 12 champs. I'm worried a little bit about where that conversation might go. But for right now, I think I'm still fine with it. I'm very curious to see. I'm also curious to see how these these venues are going to split in terms of fans. Because this is something I also saw as a potential advantage for getting that first round bye. Oregon fans, Arizona State fans, Georgia fans, and Boise State fans have had a lot of time to buy up tickets at these particular venues. And now that they know they're going, the other teams are going to have a shot to potentially, get some butts in those seats. But that'll be something we'll see on TV. I'm also curious to see how well, I don't know if I assume the Rose Bowl always sells out. They have their own ways of making sure that game sells out. But the other ones, I'm very curious to see how well they're going to be attended, and if there will be some empty seat sections in them. I'm curious, and very curious about the semifinals for that matter, because I do wonder. We talked about that, earlier on in a previous episode about SMU, deep-pocketed alumni who might be able to buy their way to potentially 4 game sites plus the conference championship game. But my goodness, this is these do get to be kind of costly for Joe fan. But before we don't have to get too much into that, let's dive into some of these. So number one, we don't have to go in chronological order. Let's just go with the Rose Bowl to start up here. Number 8, Ohio State against 8th seed, I should say, against the 1st seed, Oregon. What an exciting matchup here. I mean, I know as we were doing our bracket predictions last week, you thought this was going to be a preview of this is basically the national championship right here. After what we saw against Tennessee, I am thinking you're right. I was a little hesitant. I was like, you know what? Let's just see how Ohio State recovers from that Michigan game. But they're going into this game seemingly like the hot team in the playoff. And Oregon maybe has been cool for a little too long. I don't know. I mean, I feel Oregon is, again, that's come up before, but I feel Oregon is one of the least talked about, I don't want to go so far as to say least respected, but it does feel like no one's thinking of them as like the ultimate dominating number 1 team, and a team that has beat Ohio State before and arguably had yes, some people said, Ohio State messed it up at the end, but Oregon had a pretty strong advantage in that game. Granted, it was at home. What do you make of this matchup?
Yeah, it's a good question. And obviously these two teams have played. This is our first rematch in this year's college football playoff at this point. And in that game, Ohio State went on the road. We're in field goal range, and obviously Jeremiah Smith commits an offensive pass interference that leads to Will Howard losing sight on what was on the clock. And if the game was a 60-minute and 3-second game, then Ohio State probably wins the football game. So now at the same time, Ohio State, since that game, has lost 2 of their 3 best offensive linemen in Josh Simmons and in their center, Seth McLaughlin. Now, their offensive line certainly looked pretty good when you talk about them versus Tennessee. But, I do think that that's a factor. I think that Oregon, in some ways, will be able to take advantage a little better. So I look back at that game as well. It ended up being a 32-31 game. Lots of points scored, to be clear. But I'm curious, right? So, I assume that Ohio State's going to be able to put up points. I think that when I look at Oregon, they are a very good defense, but they're not a lockdown defense, especially when you're talking about them in the running game. I don't know exactly how special they are at stopping the run. I think they're better against the pass in some ways, but if I don't know. I mean, do you want to get into a shootout with Jeremiah Smith and Travion Henderson? Is that what you want to do? This is just such a weird matchup for me for that reason.
Absolutely. I mean, I do wonder how the extra rest that Oregon's getting for this game, how much of an advantage it's going to give them. They can again. I just the less amount of talk we've had about Oregon, maybe that suited them. Maybe they're going to come out there and remind everybody that this is why we are the number 1 team. Yeah, Boise State got close, but hey, look at where they are right now at this moment. I'm curious to see, though, especially though the momentum aspect of this, which is again. Here I talked all about the potential psychology of losing to Michigan in the way they did and how that would affect them against Tennessee. Clearly it didn't. But can this Ohio State team, now seeing how dominant they were against Tennessee, how much do they believe in themselves? They must, I'm saying that knowing that they must really believe it now, that they're going to go in there and give it their absolute, they're more motivated than perhaps they ever have been But yeah, going into this though, I'm curious to see how much we see from Dylan Gabriel and company. I know they're very good at putting points on the board. It's just funny though. I am curious to see the run up to this game and how much people start to sort of remember what makes this Oregon team so good. And I think again, just every bit of this team has been good, but they've always been the individual parts overshadowed by others. Like obviously in the Heisman Trophy race, there were some better players out there. It wasn't just the best quarterback on the number one team or anything like that. I think there is an opportunity here for Oregon to show itself. I'm very excited about this matchup. I'm very curious to see how this plays out in the in the Rose Bowl. The one place we're not going to be talking about an outdoor game and how the weather is going to affect the two teams involved there in Pasadena. I'm also excited that it's a traditional Rose Bowl match. I mean, I don't know. I'm shocked I care this much about it. I think it's fun. I'm excited for the Tournament of Roses, even though they are the ones that have kind of held the college football playoff format hostage for all these decades. I think they are the ones that finally they get there. Everyone wins.
You know what? One thing that's interesting to me. So I'm looking at College Football Insider's projection of this game, and they give Oregon a 55% chance to win to Ohio State's 45%. But like, it's so interesting to me because like I look at the numbers and like Ohio State is number 1 in EPA margin. Oregon's number 5. Ohio State is number 1 in defensive EPA. Oregon is number 9. Like, I just like keep looking at this and I'm like, where's the math that makes this add up to me, right? Like, where exactly is the math that makes it add up? Now, the funny thing is, it's kind of worse on worse in this game when you look at specifically the success rate numbers, because Ohio State is 33rd in rushing success rate. Oregon is 60th at defending the rush, which is crazy. It's by far the worst unit between these two teams, between offense defense. Now, Ohio State's kicking a whole other situation that we're not going to get into, but like, I mean, I feel like it's much more likely that Ohio State outperforms being 33rd in rushing success rate than it is that Oregon outperforms being 60th in rushing defensive success rate. And that's not even getting into the success that Ohio State had with their receivers last time. Like, in the last game, Jeremiah Smith, 9 catches, 100 yards, a touchdown. Emeka Egbuka, 10 catches, 93 yards, a touchdown. You got a magic Evan Stewart game Oregon did last time. And Ohio State's corners have had some issues, right? Like they haven't been elite this year. I think that we see them come out even more spread out. I think that they go, again, they run out of a base 3 safety look. I think we're going to see every piece of that. We're going to see Ohio State say, front 7, you got it, which obviously front 7 is actually front 6 in this scenario. But front 6, you got to take care of the run. We're not giving you any help up front. You just got to come through. And we're going to try to shut down these receivers because this is an Oregon offense that obviously has been really good passing the ball. So it will be a tremendous matchup. I think a tremendous chess game as well on both sides. I'm really excited to see it.
Absolutely. So let's move along to the Sugar Bowl. This is there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this game. This is one where we both thought Notre Dame has one of the easier paths, not because we think Georgia usually is an easy team to play, but because the injury to Carson Beck, who has been confirmed he's not going to be playing, at least in the quarterfinal game in the Sugar Bowl. Now, this is a place Georgia is quite familiar with. Of course, as the SEC champion, they were locked into playing in this classic venue for the conference. Notre Dame certainly is no stranger to this venue as well. They obviously have had a tremendous game against Indiana in the previous round. They are going to be ready for this game. They've got a strong defense and one that is going to potentially be salivating at the fact of playing a quarterback under Stockton, who isn't a bad guy or not a bad player, but this isn't the reason why Georgia got.
That's true. He is not a bad guy as far as we know.
Yeah, as far as we know. Well, our investigators will go into it. We'll find out what's wrong with him.
I'll go right into the heart of Rabun County, Georgia, where he's from, and try to figure out whether he's a bad guy.
We heard he looked mean at a dog one time. And
by the way, this is a fun fact. I wrote a story kind of looking into him a little bit. Gunnar Stockton has the all-time record in the state of Georgia, which Georgia, great high school, right? Great high school football, tremendous high school football. He passed Deshaun Watson and Trevor Lawrence for the records. He has the most passing yards, I think, passing touchdowns and total touchdowns. He has 254 total touchdowns as a high school football player. 254, including 177 passing touchdowns. That is insane.
That is. And in the end, though, I think this Notre Dame defense is going to absolutely have what they need to do against them. I think they're going to dominate on the lines of scrimmage on both sides of the ball. I think this is going to be one of those games where Notre Dame is, I mean, again, I think Notre Dame, I don't know if Notre Dame's the best team out there. I certainly don't. I think that Rose Bowl game is going to be the battle of the potential eventual national champion. But I think right now, without Carson Beck, I don't know. Well, actually, let's ask that. Without Carson Beck, what do you think Georgia's best way of winning in this game is going to be? What do you think their avenue will be?
So I mentioned on our last show, Notre Dame lost their defensive tackle, Riley Mills, with a season-ending injury. And they already lost two of their best defensive linemen earlier this season, Jordan Botello as an edge rusher, and Boubacar Traore as well. So, like, they're down three of their best pass rushers on the team. Now, Howard Cross is probably the best overall player. He plays nose tackle for them. But, like, I do think that there is a legitimate question about whether this is going to be the super elite Notre Dame defensive line that we've seen the past couple of weeks after some of the losses that they've withstood. On the Georgia side, they've gotten healthier as the season has gone along on the offensive line. The big one was their right guard, Tate Ratledge, coming back from an injury. He had tightrope surgery earlier this season, and I think that his return has been huge for this team, finding its mojo again. You look at that winning streak, I think he's been a big part of it. So I think that the best scenario for this Georgia team is being able to have some rushing success against this team. I think that having rushing success against Notre Dame with a quarterback that you just don't know what you have yet is probably that you need to run the quarterback a little bit. I don't think it needs to be a lot. I don't think it needs to be like the triple option or anything like that, but I do think that you need to play some quarterback run. I think you need to put together long possessions. We saw Notre Dame, the way that they played Indiana is how they want to play teams. They want to grind you out. They want to suffocate you, which obviously in so many ways is what Georgia wants to do as well. So I think that what you have to do offensively is you have to find a way to keep the ball moving at a high level, even though you just don't have the playmakers that you had in previous years, and you don't have a quarterback who's as experienced, of course. I mentioned 254 touchdowns for Gunnar Stockton at the high school level. He's got 2 at the college level, 0 this season. Both of those 2 came in a 63-3 win over Florida State last year, when Florida State obviously not really fielding a football team very much at that time. But I do think that you need to see a little bit at least of movement from the quarterback for them to have a chance. And then defensively, like, this has not been a quote unquote Georgia defense this year. It just hasn't. Right? Like you look 44th in drop back defensive success rate. 44th. That's crazy. That's not what we're used to seeing from Georgia. It's just, and I think that for them, like, they've been young at corner, haven't necessarily gotten guys who have stepped up for them. They've asked, I think, too much, I would argue, of Malachi Starks at safety. They're moving him everywhere. They're trying to get him into good matchups. And I just don't think that he's responded. I think he's responded as well as you'd expect. Like, it's just a lot for him. You know, when you look at Georgia's defense too, specifically their rushing defense. So during the 2021 national championship season, they held teams to 78 yards per game, number 2 in the nation, only behind Wisconsin. In 2022, they held them to 77 yards per game, which was best in the country. Last year, you saw slight slippage, not a lot, but a little bit of slippage. They dropped to number 20, but still only 3.7 yards per carry. This year, Georgia's 36th in rushing defense. Like that's not what we have expected from a Kirby Smart team. And this is a Notre Dame team that runs the ball at an incredibly high level. Like you saw Jeremiah Love break off in that game against Indiana. You saw Riley Leonard have success running the ball in that game. He had a touchdown, 11 carries for 30 yards, if I remember right. So, like, I think that those are the two aspects. Is you really need to step up your run coverage, and you also need to find a way to drag out possessions and keep the game short. Because if you start dealing with explosive plays, I just don't think that Georgia's going to be able to keep up.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I think Georgia's going to be. This is the best opportunity to get our lower seed upset game, if there is one, and it's going to be a number 7 over a number 2, mostly due to injury, unfortunately, which isn't exactly how you'd like to see it. But if you like ridiculous extrapolations, I mean, 2 seasons ago, Georgia won their finale by 58 points. Last season, they won it by 60 points. So theoretically, maybe they'll beat Notre Dame by 62 points. But I don't think that's how science actually works. But when we get back from the break, we will break down the other 2 quarterfinals here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, now we're heading over to, again, the awkward travel situation that took place because Arizona State, being the 4th seed, had to get to whatever was left. So even though there is one of the quarterfinals taking place in the same county, they're going all the way over to Atlanta. Of course, they've had plenty of advance time to plan their travel plans to play the Texas Longhorns. This is going to be the number 4 versus the number 5. This is the game that has the biggest, I believe, spread. I think Texas is favored by at least 2 touchdowns, at least early on in all of this. But it is the Big 12 champ hosting, last season's Big 12 champ, which is kind of fun. It was a really funny meme of Mo throwing, Barney out of the bar, and it was Mo was Texas throwing the Big 12 out of the bar, and suddenly behind him, Barney reappears, except it's Arizona State. So again, I don't know. All of that aside, this is a game where, and I want to go back to your article because we were talking about the fact you gave Clemson a B-, and you also gave Texas the lowest grade among the victors in the first round of games when you were grading those performances. You gave them a B, and you gave Clemson a B-, and I could see why. That game got very interesting at the end. I think Cade Klubnik really nearly kept Clemson in it, but they're out of the whole conversation now. With Texas, what do you think where do you think Texas stacks up against Arizona State? And do you think there are opportunities for Arizona State to do what Clemson could not do?
Well, the biggest reason that I gave Texas a not awesome grade was I just felt like what they did in that game is not necessarily something that's going to be sustainable when they play better teams. Now, I don't know that Arizona State is that better team, right? Like, I don't know that that's the team that's going to suffocate them. But like the reason that Texas ran for a lot of yards against Clemson is because Clemson's really bad at preventing teams from running for a lot of yards. You looked at Texas in all of their other big games, like they weren't able to run the ball at this level, and I think there's a number of reasons for that, right? Like I think there's been miscommunication issues. They also, by the way, I haven't seen updates as yet. Hopefully, we'll have them by by the time you're listening to this. Their center, Jake Majors, went out during this game, and their right tackle, Cam Williams, got rolled up on as well, also went out. And also their top running back, Quintravian Wisner, also went out with an injury. So, like, that's also something I think you got to keep an eye on, is like, if this isn't a unit that's getting back to being healthy by the time that this game rolls around, I think that's something that Arizona State can take advantage of. On the other side, too. So, Cade Klubnik, I think, heading into next year is going to be viewed as one of the top quarterbacks in the country, especially from like a gamer playmaking perspective. Sam Levitt has a little bit of that though for Arizona State, like he does. He's somebody who can go off schedule. He is somebody who can take advantage of opportunities. I think the big question is just going to be, without Jordan Tyson, who obviously we've talked about extensively, do they have the receivers to take advantage of that? Xavier Guillory is going to be the one that I'm keeping the biggest eye on. And I haven't mentioned as yet running back Cam Scadaboo. This is going to be an interesting matchup as well because, and by the way, we're going to talk about Ashton Ginty in just a second as well. But like, how much is an individual player worth to a running game? So like, I think that we've gotten past this crazy idea that running backs don't matter. I think that running backs do matter, but like, let's just say, and let me ask you this question. For example, if Cam Scadaboo is put into the game between Indiana and Notre Dame, like, does he make any difference? Does he make zero difference? Does he make a ton of difference? I mean, like, how much do you think that an individual player? Because I do think Arizona State is quite good up front, but not elite. I mean, how much difference can
Oh,
an
yeah.
individual player make? What would you expect from him?
Well, I think it can make a certain difference, especially when you see his ability to shed tackles. I mean, having someone who can push through, and I mean, we saw that performance against Iowa State. We saw what he's capable of doing against a competent defense. We saw him do it all season long. Certainly, I mean, Ashton Genty, you could put him in that same category as well. I mean, I'm not trying to take away from Boise State, but it's not, they don't recruit the same caliber of human being for their offensive line. Yet you get someone who can use what little, I mean, not what little push. I'm really lower the bar there, but what what effort they can produce and make even more out of it. I mean, that's what we are just talking about. Like, wouldn't have been. It's a terrific thing to think about how ferocious some of these P4 programs might have been with some of those guys had they moved up. Like, I mean, and maybe that is Scadaboo is an example of that. Scadaboo, he finished just outside the Heisman voting, but we saw the player that they were able to pull out of FCS and turn him into one of these difference makers on the Big 12. So yeah, I think certainly if he had been in that game, he would have been a difference maker. I don't know if he would have ultimately caused Indiana to defeat Notre Dame, but he certainly would have made them a much tougher game, a much tougher team to stop, or made the blowout even worse had he been on the the Notre Dame side of it. I mean, it's interesting too. I do wonder on the other side of the ball, Jaden Blue had a great game against Clemson, though he does have a history of dropping the ball. So maybe putting the ball on the turf. So I wonder if sometimes I'm concerned that one good game, and that is something that kind of goes into the bigger macro picture of this playoff. We're asking these guys to play 4 games in a row. If there is a habit they've occasionally had, it is likely that it's going to pop up again in one of these games, particularly if you're playing 4 of them at a time. I wonder if just comparing the running games will be something fascinating to see. Because certainly Texas has, and it was funny going back to that airport. For the last episode, as I mentioned, I got stuck in an airport lounge for 12 hours during the first round games, and I had a conversation with a Texas fan about like, wow, this your guys' running game has performed so much better than people expected after all those injuries before the season and early on in the season. But I do wonder if this is going to be fun to compare the 2 running games and how they perform against each other in the Peach Bowl.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, you look at Arizona State. I mean, they are a quite good rushing defense, especially, right? They're number 28 in the country in rushing defense. They're number 16 in the country in opposing EPA per rush. Now, I don't think they've played an offensive line as good as Texas, but we also don't know who's going to be playing for Texas on the offensive line necessarily either. So I do think that this is going to need to be a clean Quinn Ewers game, which has been, of course, a struggle at times. I've repeated, I don't think it's all his fault. 1, I don't think he's fully healthy. 2, I don't think that their receivers are as good as they were last year. And 3, I think that they've been put in some bad spots as well by their unwillingness to run the ball consistently as well. So I think that, like, to me, if this game gets messy, the line is 13 and a half. If it gets messy, like, I think Arizona State can take advantage of mess. Like, I think that they are a team that can take advantage of mess. You have 2 guys who I think are just like crazy off schedule in Cam Scadaboo and Sam Levitt. I think that you've got enough talented receivers. I mentioned it before. There are 7 guys here too who started their careers, who play for Arizona State now at the University of Texas. So like a lot of ties between these programs, a lot of other kids from the state of Texas as well. They won the Big 12 in the first year that Texas is not a member of the Big 12. So I think that Texas is going to win the game, but like it's the biggest line of the entire day, and I don't get that. I don't really get that. Like I don't think like you have a Texas team that underperformed everybody in the first round of the playoff, out of the winners. And like the other piece of this too is okay. So you have to score. You have to win by 14 points to cover in this game, which they did against Clemson. They hit 14 on the dot in a home game. Like here's a list of all of the times that they've won by at least 14 points all season long. Right, 17 points at home versus Kentucky, arguably the worst team in the SEC. A huge win against Florida when they were on their third and fourth string quarterback. So like, I feel like you have to throw that out a little bit. In between, by the way, 10-point win over Texas A&M, 10-point win over Arkansas, 3-point win over Vanderbilt. Then you go back to that Oklahoma game. Oklahoma, again, one of the worst in the SEC. Mississippi State by 22. Now, by the way, Arizona State did play Mississippi State early in the year and didn't win by a lot. I think that like we can be fair, like I think Arizona State is an improved team than they were in week 2, to say the least. They lost to Texas Tech early in the year too, and obviously turned it around. But like then you have to go like again with power conference teams. The only other one that they did was that week 2 game against Michigan where they played really well. So like they don't beat teams by 14 or more all that often. So I think that Texas wins, but it's more like 10, not close to 14.
Yeah, I think you're right. The Big 12, the middle name of the Big 12 is Mess. It's Big Mess 12. But the I do wonder though, my concern is just like Clemson this last week, is it going to be another one of these, because obviously the Big 12 and the ACC seem to be the down conferences this particular year in among the P4. And are we going to just see the best of a kind of mediocre bunch? But to be fair, I don't know where Texas stacks up. I really don't know. And again, Clemson made that game a little bit interesting. It wasn't DKR. So once they started to get their druthers, it seemed like they started to do a little bit better. And in a neutral site, can Arizona State get a little bit more oomph? And that might be enough. I do agree. It might be enough.
I think the other piece of this too is let's draw a cutoff for Arizona State's season at that Cincinnati game where, by the way, Sam Levitt got hurt. Right? They lose that game against Cincinnati because with Jeff Sims in the lineup. Since then, they beat Oklahoma State by 21 on the road. They beat UCF by 4. They beat Kansas State on the road by 10 points. They beat BYU. They crushed Arizona State by 42 points. They crushed Iowa State by 26 points. So, like, I think that when you talk about Arizona State, they have been a different team in the second half of the season. And I don't mean that to mean like, oh, they're a secret national title contender. But I just mean that from the perspective of, especially when you look at analytic systems, I think that they're factoring in a lot of data that's just out of date at this point.
I think that's a very accurate point. Now let's move on to the final of the quarterfinals, the Fiesta Bowl in Phoenix. Well, Glendale, which to me always sounds weird because I grew up in LA and everyone knows Glendale. It's a bigger city. It's the one that's outside of Los Angeles. All the great Armenian food is there. But we have Penn State versus Boise State. Now, Boise State, again, is the ultimate Cinderella this season. Indiana, great season. Look how Arizona State, great season. But the fact that a G5 team is the 3 seed is still just phenomenal, even if it is a historic G5 power like Boise State with a phenomenal player and Heisman runner-up, Ashton Jeanty. Now, they're getting their chance to really just they have high expectations. It helps it's in the Fiesta Bowl, which just has that, voodoo magic for them. But Penn State looked pretty darn good against SMU. Now, SMU also had an implosion by the player that they absolutely needed to do the best. I doubt Ashton Jeanty is going to have a day like that. I don't think he's capable of having a day like that. Maybe it's also not to say that running backs are simpler people, but you're not asking them to do as much. You're asking them to shed tackles and move forward and look for cuts and do grip maneuvers. And those are things that I think Jeanty can do in his sleep. He probably does it in his sleep. They probably find him in the morning sometimes, in his sleep. Imagine if he sleptwalked. Imagine being a guy like that and sleepwalking, and suddenly you find them breaking tackles that actually end up just being random people on the street. But all of that said, what do you think of this? Because I feel like Penn State's in kind of an awkward situation here because they're having a good season. Although I did feel one of my favorite comments I read about the game was well, if James Franklin won the game, against SMU, did he really win a big game? If he wins it, was the game ever big to begin with? I mean, could he reach the national championship, win it? It's like, well, it wasn't really a big game. You still can't win the big game. But they're in an awkward one because you're playing Boise State. You're playing the ultimate Cinderella of them all. And is this a situation where Boise State can have any hope of finding success against guys like Abdul Carter, who put on a phenomenal performance against SMU?
Well, I think that this game is like, everybody's going to talk about Boise State's offense against Penn State's defense in this game. But I actually think the inverse might be more interesting in some ways. And what I mean by that is, like, Boise State has had one of the most disruptive defenses in the country this season. They actually are number 2 nationally with 51 sacks as a team. Only one other team has more than 40 sacks in the entire country, and that team is Ole Miss, who obviously we saw what they did to Georgia. And they've got some guys, we've talked a lot this season about Ahmed Hassani, and like, he's somebody who's going to play in the NFL. He's somebody who could be a top 3 or 4 round draft pick if he tests well. So, like, I do think that Boise State has the ability to get Penn State behind the chains, especially early in this game. And I mean, I mentioned it, right? Like, I think that when you look at that SMU versus Penn State game, there were moments where SMU's defense, especially in that first half, like, they were winning the battle. Like, they were keeping them behind the chains. Penn State didn't score its first touchdown that wasn't off of a turnover until the final drive of the first half, right? Like, and some of that is because SMU got to hold on to the ball a lot longer because they threw pick sixes, but like, there were also a lot of unsuccessful drives that Penn State put together as well. So, how much do we learn from that? I think that with Boise State, right, it's going to be, how do they crash gaps? Obviously, their defensive line is a known commodity, but are they able to do it with consistency with their linebackers? Are they able to do it against an offensive line that is used to physicality, that won't be surprised by what Boise State brings to the table? And the other piece, too, is we've talked all year about the fact that Penn State's wide receivers don't win a lot one-on-one against defensive backs. Well, I think that Boise State's secondary is going to be an interesting matchup for them. Like, they're not awesome against the pass. So that's kind of the dynamic I'll be watching most. I think on the other side, Ashton Jeanty is going to put up his numbers. They're going to be able to do some stuff off of play action, but like, they need this to be a low-scoring game to have a chance.
Absolutely. This is going to be, I am so in love with this particular 12-team playoff. Yeah, the first round games weren't that close, but we're settling it on the field. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this episode up. I wanted to tell you on behalf of all of us, if you're listening, have a happy holidays. This is a good week. We hope you're enjoying it however it is you'd like to. Hopefully, if you're at work too, it's passing fairly quickly this week. But we're going to thank all of you. Wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com. And that's Shehan Jayaraja on X, TikTok, and Blue Sky. We hope he's feeling better soon. I'm Bobak Kyrie, part of the group that runs Reddit RCFB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great one.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.